They're coming to get you, Barbara. They're coming for you, Barbara.
Howdy, and welcome to our main topic tonight. We have a few guests, but we're going to be discussing Friends versus Seinfeld. We like both of these shows, and we're going to discuss tonight what we think about them, a few different things. With us, we also have a studio audience tonight. They're going to be joining us, so hopefully if we're good, we'll get a couple of laughs out of them.
Who are we kidding? It's just a laugh track.
Yeah, that's okay. We'll use it when necessary. But first, I'd like to introduce the person arguing on my side, which is going to be Sarah Plainenthal. Why don't you give us a little hello there?
Hello there.
So she'll be fighting with me on the side of Friends, and joining Schreck over there, fighting on the side of Seinfeld. We have Johnny Rico. Go ahead and give us a howdy.
Howdy, y'all.
So I think we're gonna just go ahead and before we get started, I think Schreck and I both agree that both shows are really great, and even though I'm fighting on the side of Friends, it's the show I like more. I do want to say I really enjoy Seinfeld in a lot of ways. Costanza, I think, is hands down the best character in both of these shows overall. Even though he's an extreme version, he's really relatable to my own personal life in some ways. And I think there's just some amazing things about the show that stand out. The realistic nature of it reminds me of some movies that I like that are more drama versions of just movies about nothing. And I think that there's a lot of great things that the show, and obviously it went for a long time and had a huge cultural impact. And I think a lot of people really enjoyed it.
I'm kind of a fan of both Friends and Seinfeld. Obviously, I think Seinfeld is a little bit better of a show. I think the writing was a lot better, but Friends, I watched the premiere episode. I remember when it came out. I also I did watch it regularly as it came out. Each new episode that came out all the time. I guess it was because it was on the same night as Friends, so I watched it quite a bit. But I did end up watching a lot of the reruns and everything like that. So I do like Friends. I just don't think it's as good of a show as Seinfeld is.
I'm more of a Friends fanatic. I have seen maybe a handful of Seinfeld episodes, and they're okay. They're just not my cup of tea, so to speak. Friends is my along my lines.
Don't you have a real serious problem with Larry David, and that's the reason why you don't like Seinfeld?
I do have a serious problem with Larry David. He just gets on my nerves.
So Curb Your Enthusiasm isn't your show?
Oh, I hate it. I hate it.
I'm kind of like Sarah on the other end of the spectrum. I've only seen like a handful of episodes of Friends. Pretty good. Made me laugh, but Seinfeld is definitely near and dear to my heart. Kind of, in a lot of ways, shaped my sense of humor. As a person, like, not just like quoting some of the lines, but just like how I kind of view the world. So yeah, obviously I'm definitely more a fan of that.
All right, well, let's go ahead and get into why I think Friends is a better show. Hopefully we don't get while we were prepping for this, I could tell there was a little bit of bad blood when we get talking about it. So hopefully we don't get
it got a little heated.
Yeah, let's hopefully we don't get too angry about what's going on here. But first, I think first reason I think Friends is a better show is the characters. The characters I feel are so much more relatable. You have 3 men, 3 women, both all from different. Well, I would say all from different backgrounds, except they're all white. Except that that's the main thing about all of these shows. They're all white. Which is okay, I suppose. It was the 90s still. And I think the characters are just more relatable as people. They're not as extreme versions of people. They really have they have jobs. They have to go to work. They have careers in some respects. Some of them are in dead ends. They have life struggles that they encounter, and you just really understand who they are as people and feel more like they're they're actual people that you could know, maybe not somebody who is, like if you ever saw The Fighter with, you couldn't believe that Christian Bale's character was real. I feel that's how a lot of the Seinfeld characters are. Oddly enough, Christian Bale's character was real, but that's just such an extreme personality, and I think you see that more so in Seinfeld with Kramer, who is completely unbelievable as a character, in my opinion.
And I think, Kramer, although a completely unbelievable character, I find that all of the Seinfeld or the Friends characters are all just complete cliches. Phoebe is the dumb blonde. You've got the cheerleader in Rachel. Monica is obviously, the kind of goofy, nerdy person, nerdy girl. Then you get the dumb jock in Joey. You get the nerd in Ross. He's a paleontologist. What's more nerdy than that, right? And then you obviously get the regular guy, the Chandler Bing.
But you see, over the things, I feel that all these characters, we all are kind of cliches. When you first meet us, we all come off as cliches. When people meet us, they see us as nerds, as metalheads, whatever. But when you get to know us, there is a lot more depth to us, and I think you see that over the course of the show.
And I would disagree. First of all, I disagree with the fact that people think that I'm a cliche when they meet me. I'm a Schreck. Everybody who meets me kind of has their own little impression about me. But, yeah, and I think they kind of remain cliches throughout the entire series. They never really change. What are your thoughts on it, Sarah?
I think that, yes, they have the cliches, but that's how, when you first meet somebody, you project, well, what's the most important part of you is that cliche part, and you're going to show that, and hopefully if they latch on, then they latch on, and you come to know them, that yes, they have that cliche part of them, but that's not necessarily what they are about, or that may be their past, like Rachel being the cheerleader, but that's not what has molded her to be who she is now. It's not one of those things where it's set in stone. It's like it's the ground, if you will, the foundation, but it's not what's keeping them, there. That's not necessarily what defines them the whole time.
And it seems like we're spending a lot of time talking about the Friends characters.
Mm-hmm.
John, what are your thoughts on the Seinfeld characters?
Well, of course they don't feel like real people, but that's not the point of it. Like, I mean, in a lot of comedies, like since the beginning, extreme circumstances, whether things that characters are put into or circumstances that they create for themselves, that's just the foundation for a lot of great comedy. And even though they're not real, there's still aspects of them, like, sure, Kramer is kind of a doofus, and like the kind of schemes that he comes up with are
when we mention schemes here with Kramer, can we, I can just give you an example, the living in a shower episode. I mean, how ridiculous is that, and how unbelievable is that possibility of someone trying to live in he's eating sandwiches in there. I mean, it's completely over the top.
But can you argue with it? It was freaking hilarious.
It was hilarious. I'm not arguing that it wasn't hilarious.
And that's fine, but what I mean, but like, sure, the schemes are over the top or whatever, but everybody has had those ideas of something, and then they change their mind. They figure out like that it's ridiculous or whatever. And I think that Kramer is really admirable in a lot of, or like maybe not admirable, but you kind of applaud him for going through it, like trying to take an idea, no matter how ridiculous it is, and make the most of it, whether he fails or succeeds. Usually fails, but still, like, I mean, he's brave enough to go through it, and I really like that about that character, at least.
Yeah, and I mean, the characters in Seinfeld, they, again, we're talking about shows, they're sitcoms. Obviously, none of these people are going to be fully three-dimensional characters. We're not watching The Wire. We're not watching something that's written meant to be well-rounded. They're both meant to have very comedic parts of their characters. And even in that more, I'm going to move on to why I think another reason that Friends is better is relating to that is the shows are where Seinfeld is a straight comedy, Friends is a dramedy, so they have to have more story arcs over the show instead of just individual episodes standing out. They have to have more to build that drama into the show. They have to have continuing storylines with characters. And as we've seen from, most people who watched TV love, look at the popularity of, as I said, The Wire, Breaking Bad, and our drama shows. They love the continuing story arc. And now we've even started to see it in our sci-fi shows, in our horror shows like American Horror Story. So in comedy, you want to add that drama aspect. I think gives it another layer that Seinfeld is missing. It only represents itself as a straight comedy. So you only get these great moments, and there are amazing moments. There's, as I was, say commonly, it was the grapefruit. Whenever I'm winking at someone or something along those lines. There's so many moments you can define from the individual episodes. But I can only name a couple of story arcs that lasted more than an individual episode, where I grew with the story and it felt like real life more so. Even though for a show that's about nothing, that's supposed to be about real life, you didn't see much of the continuation of what you see day to day in real life, relationships that you form with people and romantic interest and things like that. They came very quickly and left, and along those lines, I think Seinfeld was missing that aspect.
And I wholeheartedly disagree with that. I think that was the point of the 90s when you started to see television change. It started out as very sitcom-y, going back to like I Love Lucy, and before that, everything was a one shot. You made one episode, and then that was the end of it. When you got into the 90s, you started seeing shows that had these continuing storylines, and now it's just full blown, episode. If you missed the last episode, you're lost. And I think with Seinfeld, what happened is let me kind of clarify here. I find the best show, that one of my favorite science fiction shows, the way it works is for Stargate, is there is a continuing storyline, but each episode you can just pop in and watch it at any time. And I think that's the best format. That way, if you miss an episode, you're not completely lost, anything like that. And Seinfeld had continuing storylines. It had the story with them developing the show. Several relationships lasted for several long episodes. You also had the whole Susan thing, not only when they were doing the show, but also with the marriage and everything with George.
Was that the longest running relationship, would you say, of any of the characters in the show? Did anyone else have a relationship that lasted that long, where they knew were in a romance relationship with someone at any point longer than that?
No, honestly, there probably isn't a romance on Seinfeld that lasted as long as Joey and Chandler's relationship with the chickens. There wasn't a single relationship that lasted that long, so that was probably the longest one. It was separated into two parts.
How do you know roughly how long their relationship was over the course of the two different parts when they first dated?
Honestly, I don't think it was very long.
Mr. Rico over there, do you happen to have any clue?
I would think that I think I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure Elaine and Putty lasted a while, and I would say that relationship was even funnier. It didn't end as comedically because, spoilers, Putty doesn't die, but still, Putty is one of my favorite characters of all of Seinfeld. Way better than Susan ever was.
And how long would you estimate that relationship lasted? Would a season, a few episodes? Can you give me an idea, just so I can, for my own argument, that you're helping my argument, in my opinion?
I'd say, it wasn't every episode that their relationship was shown, but it had to be like at least a couple seasons off and on. They one of my favorite episodes, the episode that is played backwards, like Putty.
Memento style?
Yeah, Memento style. Before Memento. But yeah. But he was definitely on there. Like, them stuck in that cramped space on the airplane is comic gold. Like, it doesn't get better than that.
Well, and I think the whole greatness of Seinfeld is that these stories, they didn't need to do these continuing stories. They could do a new story every single week. They didn't have to have these long-lasting romances or anything like that. And it was still, every single week, it was water cooler stuff. It was comedy gold. When you got in there, You knew every Thursday night that you were in for a ride when it came to a Seinfeld episode. You didn't have to wait for next episode or the season finale to find anything big happening. Nothing big ever happened. And it just so happened that that show was, it just defined that whole generation, in the 90s.
And I want to get a female perspective, because I think the drama is part of the reason that added to the show. And you got to remember, 51% of all people on the planet are women, and shows should also appeal to both sexes. And I feel Friends does a much better job of doing that because of the continuing story arcs in the relationships, because that's a big part of life. So let's hear from Plain and Tall over here.
Female power, man. No. Friends, I agree that Seinfeld was very episodic, but I think Friends was episodic too. It had, like, especially I noticed towards the end, the later seasons, where they had like a goal. The beginning of the season, what started with an idea and then ended with that idea.
Yeah, well, when we mentioned later seasons, I think we can both agree both shows kind of declined a little bit in their later seasons, because they both started to struggle a little bit more. Would everyone agree on that?
I would not agree. I love the last few seasons of Seinfeld more than, I think they're on par with everything in the beginning.
I like the later seasons of Friends because I've already know the friends. I know their characters, but I could see them like mature and or grow from like the beginning to the point they are at now.
And Rico?
I'd say I like the last, was it 2 seasons of Seinfeld a lot. Like, Larry David left, and the writers just kind of went hog wild. Like, some of the most ridiculous plot lines were formed during that, and I don't know. I like the surreal aspect of a lot of the plots that they wrote during that time.
Well, apparently I was wrong, and I'm of only a single mind. So go ahead and continue there.
Well, actually, from just talking about this, and when we were getting ready to do this subject, I read a lot of forums where people said basically both shows really struggled in the early years, really struggled in the later years, and they were really, really good right in the middle. So you're not alone in that assertion. You're just not along with the group here.
Not in the room, at least. Yeah. Okay, go ahead and continue.
Well, I will agree. I will admit that I watched Friends during the meat of it, and towards the end of it, I wasn't really watching it on a regular basis. It wasn't until later in my life, that I started watching it as reruns and that. So I don't necessarily, I like the later characters, but I wasn't as in tune with them when it was airing for the first time.
I think since we're real quick, just to give a point to that about what you mentioned on later in life, I watched both shows in reruns when they were airing, and I did watch the finales of both shows when they aired. But I think I really grew into them later in my life as well. I don't know how. For me, I never was as big a fan when they were airing as I was after they went off the air.
And I was a big fan of both of them when they were on there, and I enjoyed them reruns. I can still watch the reruns of Seinfeld, but going back to something that you said earlier, most fans would agree that even people who kind of only liked Friends but really liked Seinfeld would agree that the Seinfeld finale kind of sucked. I honestly didn't think it was that bad, but most fans agree that the finale sucked for Seinfeld, and even as bad as they still think that the Friends finale was obviously a better episode just because they hate that last episode of Seinfeld so much.
Well, it gave more closure to the show. I mean, it really solidified what the show stood for, and Seinfeld's really, I don't think, summed it up in any way.
I never saw the last episode of Friends, but I'd say that the last episode of Seinfeld did not feel like a Seinfeld episode, and I was pretty disappointed about that. I don't know why they had to give closure to them, like where they went and why prison. Like, why would they go there? Like, for like crimes against humanity? Like, they weren't that bad. They're just situational, and they found themselves in crappy situations, and I don't think that's that bad.
Yeah, and since we're talking about the finales, I'm gonna go ahead and mention one of my final thoughts here, which is about how I felt the characters in Friends really grew over the course of the show. In Seinfeld, obviously, it was a throwback to the pilot of the first episode. It's showing that the characters were in pretty much the exact same spot they were in when the show started. I mean, the characters really stayed the same in Seinfeld. You never really saw Jerry grow. You never saw Costanza grow. You never saw Kramer grow. At the end of the show, they were the characters they were at the beginning of the show. They never grew as people. Whereas when you look at Rachel and how she started off as this vapid person who has such a lack of personality and really wasn't developed as a human being. And then you look at Ross, who was just coming out of his divorce, and then by the end of the show, he's already divorced 2 more times and has a couple of kids, and and things like that. The show really grew, and the characters, like life, changed, and life took them places, and things happened. And by the end of the show, especially in the finale, you see them moving on with their life, and they all agree to stay in touch, but no longer can they live in the city. Their life wasn't what it was before. They've moved into being adults now. They're no longer these 20-somethings trying to find who they were. They found who they were. Now they're finally moving into middle life, what it means to grow and be successful when you buy your house, you have kids, you settle down, you start to you have your career, everything is finalized. You don't get that in Seinfeld. You get your characters are still the same people that have the same flaws. Not that the characters in Friends didn't still have their flaws, but you don't see them develop and learn from their lessons and learn from the mistakes that they had.
Well, and that was the whole point of Friends anyway. That continuing story arc. You wouldn't want to see the same people that you had originally when you began the show. But the whole point of Seinfeld to begin with was that these people are selfish jerks just like normal people. They might have been a little bit, blown up in their characterizations, but they were still the same jerks that they were in the beginning. Nothing changed. They're just like normal people, and I think that's some of the brilliance of the writing with Seinfeld, is that they did something different. These characters didn't grow and change and everything like that. They remained the same way.
So you don't think what was Seinfeld on, 10 years?
Seinfeld was on 9.
9 years, so it was on 1 year less than Friends. Not anything really of argument there, but you don't think in 9 years, if you look back at who you were 9 years ago, you've changed as a person and grown?
Not really. The essence, you can argue with me all you want, but the essence of who I am is still the same. And those characters, right from the beginning, you knew they were never going to change. That's just the way they were. Costanza obviously wasn't going to change. Kramer not going to change. Elaine,
it's because they're not real people.
Well, neither are the Seinfeld. Neither are the Friends people.
A cheap shot.
Yeah, neither are the Friends people. They're not realized people. They're
touche.
cliches. And whereas the Friends characters, I think, are cliched people, the Seinfeld characters are just blown up, exaggerated forms of normal people. And that's the way the show should have ended. If they had some great revelation or anything like that, people would have totally hated it way more than the finale that they already did. If they had some great epiphany where they changed their whole life and their whole perspective.
Well, I'm not saying that's a problem with. I'm not saying that's a problem with the finale. I'm saying that's why it's an inferior show, is because the characters didn't grow over the course of the show.
Not every character has to grow. If you had every single show where every single character grew, life would be boring.
But if things stay static, it is boring. Nothing changes. Nothing changes over time.
Well, I mean, sitcom means situational comedy, and I think that the point of Seinfeld wasn't the characters, it was the characters in these situations and how they dealt with them.
So would you say the characters in Seinfeld are less important to the overall show than the characters in Friends, and that the situations in Seinfeld are what made the show more stand out than Friends is what makes it a better show? Is that it's a plot, not necessarily a plot, a moment-driven show, than a character-driven show?
No, I mean, the characters made the plots. It was the combination of the plot and the character that's within it. Like, you can't have one without the other, and sure, the character is absurd, but so are the plots, so they fit, like, they mesh well. Like, it's not like it's some, like, boring person in a ridiculous situation. Like, I'm not.
they complemented each other very well. Good, crazy story, crazy characters.
Yeah, I mean the characters in Seinfeld were definitely very crazy, and the stories were always kooky. I mean, there's a lot, as we said, there's a lot of great memorable moments when you think about the Lost in the parking garage. You can name all these specific moments, but I can't really, name what happened else in the episode. I can't tell you what happened besides that one moment in the episode here and there. It's a collection of moments instead of a storyline.
And equally, I cannot tell you what happened in an individual Friends episode, so that's just the way it is. All I know is that Ross and Rachel had a little thing. He had a crush on her in high school. They ended up together at the end of the show. I mean,
So you don't remember what happened to Chandler and Monica?
Oh, yeah, they got married. But that's just another moment. You can't remember the same thing with Friends. You can't remember what happened in individual episodes.
I can remember their build-up of their relationship over the course
of
multiple seasons.
Stuff.
Yeah, the start of Monica and Chandler was awesome. They happened to feel lonely at the same time, and so that's how they got together, is they were lonely at the same time and realized that they had things in common. They loved each other.
And I can name other things that it was inspired by the rest of the episode. The fact that her brother was getting married and they were in England. It was in a romantic situation, and she was feeling desperate because of what the situations were led to directly by the storyline building up into it, and creating these conflicts that arise naturally through the progression of life and through the progression of the storyline that you didn't see in Seinfeld. It was like, usually, how often did a storyline carry over at all from the previous episode that could have led into the situation? It's something happens that leads to them doing something immediately. There's very long-term ramifications of everything. You did see him when Costanza quits his job. You do see the long-term ramifications of that. You do see a lot of things, but for the most part, there's not as much of that in the show. You don't see that as often.
Yeah, well, you get the sitcom butterfly effect in Friends, where every little thing that anybody does gets transposed through the episodes all the way through the end of the season, or through the end of the series. You look at the very first episode with Rachel running out on her wedding, and that all leads to the very eventual ending that you get on the finale, where her and Ross hook up.
Where she runs in to meet him at the end.
I don't know. Maybe I'm just not into the whole, will he, will she, why aren't they getting together? They were on a break. I'm just not into that whole thing. I like my sitcoms to be funny and not dramedy.
Oh, we want to talk about memorable moments. That on a break, I still see that everywhere. Anytime you have an issue with a relationship, someone always claims they're on a break. I mean, that's typical it has become a part of our culture. And I think both shows obviously have become a part of our cultures. As we're finishing up here, we want to reiterate that we love both shows. Both shows are good. Both shows have great actors. Both shows have great situations, as John so poignantly pointed out, that it's sitcom stands for situation comedy. It's like how I learned just the other day that .com stands for communication. Commercial.
Well, what it really comes down to is like I said, I like Friends episodes still, but I think Seinfeld is a far superior show. But what it really comes down to is, even though I think the characters are very cliche, I would still say that they probably are more relatable, and the story, the overarching story of the show, is more relatable. However, each individual episode, the way people usually live their lives, is way more relatable in Seinfeld. And I thought Seinfeld was a very relatable show in that aspect. So it really just comes down to, do you like relatable characters or relatable stories?
All right, to finish it off here, I want to ask, from either show, obviously I imagine we're each going to pick from our own sides, what is your favorite moment that instantly comes to mind? We didn't prepare this. I'm asking everybody on the fly. I'll go ahead and start so everybody has a second to really think about it. And for me, the moment that stands out, I remember actually watching this air live. For me, the moment, it's not even if I had to pick, related to my favorite Friends at all, because it doesn't have Emily in it. I'm going to go ahead and say the Super Bowl episode where you have Julia Roberts and Jean-Claude Van Damme guest starring in it. It was during the second season, premiered right after the Super Bowl ended. There's a scene where Julia Roberts tricks Chandler into getting into her underwear in a bathroom stall and ditches him in the restaurant for some revenge that happened when they were children in kindergarten and he pantsed her or something along those lines. And I just remember watching it live and it being hilarious and it sticking with me. And that for me would probably be my favorite moment.
Favorite moment from Seinfeld. Obviously, I'm going to pick a Seinfeld moment, but that's a hard one. While you're sitting there talking, I'm trying to think of one. The one that comes up to me is the Frogger episode. It's late in the series.
I do remember. I actually watched that one live.
Yeah, the Frogger episode. I remember the end scene where he's actually with the Frogger arcade game, and he's going across the streets in New York, avoiding the cars and stuff like that.
Playing Frogger on it.
Playing Frogger. I mean, it's
to
so
keep his
ridiculous,
high score.
But I can still see that scene as I'm talking about it now, and that's the first scene that came to my mind as my ultimate scene from Seinfeld.
What would you say, Plain and Tall, what would you say is your favorite? I'm going to guess it's a Friends moment since you've only seen a couple episodes.
I don't know what necessarily is my favorite Friends moment. Probably when Monica and Chandler finally admit that yes, they are in a relationship and yes, they actually care about each other and it's not just something that's kind of happening and they're having fun with it, and that they actually have strong feelings for each other.
How surprised am I that hers would be a more dramatic moment than a more comedic moment. That's pretty funny that the girl chooses that moment.
Of course the girl chooses the more romancy part, but it was actually funny in the way that they did it too. So I love humor and the yes, it was dramatic, but there was humor in it too.
I just want to say something about the Frogger episode. Earlier I was talking about how Larry David left the show and it became way ridiculous, and I'm pretty sure that's one of the episodes that was written in his absence, and yeah, I'd have to agree with that being one of the best. But
real quick thought on that episode was actually only before the end of the show. I remember watching it leading up to the finale.
Okay, yeah, okay. So I'm right. I'm glad I'm right. Because I was scared that I wouldn't be. I don't know. I thought of a few other moments after you initially asked the question, but the one that immediately popped in my head, and it's weird because I don't really think about this moment that often, but there's the episode of Seinfeld, obviously Seinfeld, that Kramer realizes that shaving his face with butter makes his face smoother than with shaving cream, and he likes the feel of his face so much that he uses on his entire body, and he decides to douse himself in butter and then go up to the roof for a quick little sun tanning session and falls asleep. And this is a little bit of a build up, but anyway, so he goes back down and he's at a restaurant in the back talking to Jerry, and a waiter comes through and knocks parsley and parmesan onto him, and it sticks to the butter, and Newman smells it from the other room, and I love it because they've always been kind of like the duo of Seinfeld, like they're the best of friends, and then in that moment Newman just turns into a ravenous psychopath. And it's off screen, but you can hear the screaming of Kramer, and for some reason that's just always stuck with me. It's hilarious.
Okay, I think that's a good way to end our show right there. So there you go. That's what we think about the shows. Again, maybe you have an opinion. If you've seen enough episodes of either show, you'll have an opinion on which show you like more. Obviously, we're pretty divided. Though some of us like both, some of us are not familiar with both. Maybe you have an opinion, maybe you don't. So there you go.
Well, just in closing here, what do you think? Do you think Friends, Seinfeld? It really is personal choice what type of comedy you like. So for now, we're just going to turn it to Mr. Joshua and Mr. Joshua's Tea Time.
Tea time! Tea time!
Hi, welcome back to another Tea Time with Mr. Joshua. We're continuing our discussion on Doctor Who this week. We're continuing with my Piccadilly blend still, and we're going to jump back into it now with the fourth Doctor, some people would say is the greatest Doctor, Tom Baker. Obviously, he's the most representative of the show, most commonly identified as the Doctor. Americans know him from PBS in the 80s, how he started to become known around the world here in the States. But he's most identified in England, everywhere. His outfits, his hair. He's the Doctor. He's most people's visions of the Doctor. I think I don't know how you would feel, but was he your first person you encountered as the Doctor?
No, first person I actually encountered, sadly, was well, I don't think sadly, but David Tennant was the first one, just from watching you on your Doctor Who excursions.
On my quest into the show, yeah. No, oddly enough, he's not one of my favorites. He's commonly voted the best Doctor. I think he still won it again in the last poll on the Doctor Who magazine. He had the longest run of the original series, and of any series. He was on the show for 7 years as the Doctor. Had the most number of stories. He ran it. Basically, he made the show the legend that it was. It started to become huge from the first episode. It made it through the second Doctor. The third Doctor was large, but nobody stood up against the fourth Doctor. His era was the most watched, and it had the most. I mean, Douglas Adams came out of that era. There's so many classic companions, and everybody loves the fourth Doctor.
Well, I don't know. Watching the fourth Doctor for myself, I just can't get past the huge scarf, the big hat, the big teeth. I mean, he was kind of ridiculous looking. I'd probably say, you know what, Colin Baker is not the most odd-looking Baker. Tom Baker definitely takes the cake on that one.
Tom Baker's good, but I mean, he did have some good stories, and he had some good companions. Sarah Jane was his companion. Obviously, she was solidified. She was with him for 2 seasons. She made herself a legend in that show, and he had Leela, who would come in later and would be as one for the dads. She would have those leather outfits that everyone loved, the leotards. So
I got to tell you, I watched the first episode, The Faces of Evil, is it?
The Faces of Evil, my favorite fourth Doctor story, oddly enough.
I watched it with the first episode with Leela, and I got to say, for a British chick in the middle of the 1970s, she was pretty attractive.
And I'm surprised you actually seem to enjoy that. I think that's one of the most I've ever seen you enjoy a Doctor Who episode that I showed for you, because I've shown you a few of them before.
I've watched a few episodes. My issue with a lot of the newer Who, but I didn't get it in this one, is the writing was really good. There was a lot of great lines that I thought was in that I thought were in that episode, which you don't really get this day and age. It's all about action and go and jump into the next scene and stuff. But I thought the dialogue was really well written. It's hard for me to get past some of the production value that they had and some of that kind of stuff. So I did enjoy the episode strictly for the dialogue, pretty much.
Yeah, we can agree that that's the main reason one of the main reasons you could never love Doctor Who is even when it's got good story, the production's a little bit much. You don't like the cheesy costumes, the bad sets, the cheesy acting, everything like that, the overacting. That's not something you're a fan of in general with Doctor Who.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. I love that stuff. It's just that in Doctor Who, I don't know, it just bothers me a little bit more. I don't know what it is.
So towards the end of his run, the show did start to get you could tell he was wearing out a little bit. In his last season, John Nathan Turner would come in over the show, and he added the famous question marks to his outfit for the first time, which we'll discuss as we get to the other Doctors, because it was kind of a little subtle at first, at least. And he dumped his good companion of Romana, my favorite of his companions personally, who was Tom Baker's wife in real life. And they dumped her and started adding some other companions. And then at the end of his run, we came in with the fifth Doctor, Peter Davidson, and he by the time he had his run started, he had 3 companions already up and running, ready to go.
That's Mr. Celery, right?
Mr. Celery, if you want to call him that, yes, you could call him Mr. Celery. So he took over in '81, and he started off, and his era is a little bit unusual. My biggest concern, besides some of the decline in you would start to see in the budget and the writing, is his companions. He did seem to have a lot of companions.
It seemed like they wanted to go from one companion to having a bunch of them. Isn't that what kind of what you say.
Yeah, and I mean and the sad part was it was fine with the earlier Doctors. I loved having Zoe and Jamie with the second Doctor, but with his companions Nyssa and Turlo and Tegan and Adric, and most of them were just really bland and they didn't really have a lot of depth, and I felt they didn't mesh together well with each other and the Doctor. But I still like some of his episodes. He still had a good era. I mean, the Caves of Androzani is generally considered one of the best Doctor Who episodes.
Would you consider that your favorite?
Definitely of the fifth Doctor. I don't know if I would say it's my favorite overall. It is definitely up there. I'd have to give it some serious thought. It's very, very wonderful, very violent. Oddly enough, for a Doctor Who story, a lot of horrible, morally corrupt people in it. But it's great. And it's actually his regeneration story, and it really kind of ends with a bang. You have Colin Baker coming in.
Quite literally ends with a bang.
Yeah, it's Colin Baker comes in, and it's very shocking as the Sixth Doctor, as he takes over, and he's just instantly they wanted to make a statement, and I don't know, a lot of people disagree how they did it. I'm actually quite a big fan of Colin Baker's era, partially because I can't help myself because of Perry, Nicola Bryant, who I've had oddly a little bit of personal interaction with that didn't go so well, unfortunately.
Tell us about that.
Just we had some different views on some things. We had a little disagreement on Twitter, and unfortunately, she didn't. The discussion just didn't go well. Her followers didn't agree with me. I'm not going to get into the specifics of it, but unfortunately I had to unfollow her on Twitter, even though I'm a huge fan of Perry. She was my favorite companion for a while.
But personally, you guys were too different.
Very different. We come from very different belief systems, and so. But it was nice actually having physical conversation, like having a conversation, even if it was a disagreement on Twitter with her. It was quite nice having a talk with her. Made me feel a little closer to Doctor Who actually, and especially the Sixth Doctor, because when I first fell in love with Doctor Who, he was one of I kind of loved the tacky '80s era as the show was declining. He had these horrible outfits, these bad sets, these bad stories, the bad effects. Everything was going to decline. They stopped even during the Sixth Doctor's era. The show pretty much was canceled at one point, but they brought it back after an 18-month hiatus, reduced the amount of episodes.
Wasn't the question mark, didn't that come back in with Colin Baker? Which, by the way, is most fans generally considered to be the worst Doctor.
Yes, I was quite a fan of him. And the Fifth Doctor did have it too, but it started to become much more blatant in how they would do his outfit. His outfit, they went specifically for a bad outfit. They made sure they put question marks everywhere. It was starting to become everywhere. Not as bad as we would see in the Seventh Doctor, which I'll get into in a second. But overall, I love the Sixth Doctor's era. Vengeance on Varus, I think, says a lot about our society. There's some solid episodes. I mean, for starters, Perry, her outfits, her little shorts and everything she's running around in. Another one for the dads, as they say about Doctor Who. I just got to say, I really like his era. I think even though it's got some bad writing and there's some really bad stinkers in it, it's got some great episodes.
What's the best one?
Vengeance on Varus, as I said, is I think the best one. It says a lot about our society. It's about.
What about the worst one?
There's so many. The Mark of the Rani is just so bad. I even couldn't. I've only sat through it once. I will not rewatch it. It's pretty rough. Kate O'Mara does a great job. She obviously was quite legendary. They brought her back in the 30th anniversary for Dimensions in Time in '93. So she was obviously important to the show, but just horrible.
Right.
But at the end of his era, we had the trial of a Time Lord, and it ended with him going off. And then, unfortunately, decided they wanted to go in a different direction, and they wanted to bring in a new Doctor, and they just decided to cancel him, even though he was scheduled for another season. And we had the Seventh Doctor coming in,
which is my boy, Sylvester McCoy.
Sylvester McCoy, that is correct. And so much they even had the audacity to ask Colin Baker if he wanted to return to film the last episode, one last story in the next season, and then have him regenerate at the end. Of course, he felt this was an insult, refused, and they just put wig over Sylvester McCoy in the first episode, had him fall off a bike, and they called it and said, "Oh no, he's regenerated." So unfortunately, it was kind of a sad exit for the Sixth Doctor.
Yeah, that's a pretty bad way to. You can tell that in the '80s they were just doing a terrible job production, and the episode lengths went down from, or the episode, didn't they lengths go down? Oh, that was in the original.
The amount of episodes. I mean, the show originally in the first Doctor started with 40 some episodes a season. Then in the third Doctor it went down to 20 and stayed that way all the way through the fifth Doctor. And in the sixth Doctor they reduced the episodes, and then after it was brought back after its hiatus they reduced it again, and then they just they kept reducing it. They were trying to kill the show. The BBC was trying to kill the show, and unfortunately there are some good episodes. I mean, a lot of people say Ace is the first modern companion, because we finally started to see a little bit about her family and a little bit about, backstory, that she was a real person, not just someone along for the ride that was going to be ditched again. Unfortunately, we didn't get to see a lot of the stuff they did want to do. I mean, but The Greatest Show in the Galaxy, I think, is a great episode. I can't help it. I love Mel with her little quirkiness, and I just think, even though it's a rough era to watch, you really have to be dedicated and a fan of Doctor Who. I think if you love obviously if you care about Doctor Who at all, it's something you should check out if you can get into the classics.
What year did Sylvester McCoy's era end?
It ended in '89, and actually, if I believe it ended in December in '89. The show ran from '63 to '89, 26 years. It did have an 18-month hiatus in '86, but it definitely ran. That was the end of its run, and it stood out. I mean, obviously, how many shows run for 26 years? That's it. It was a testament to science fiction, to British culture. It had already become iconic at that point. It's unfortunate that it had to disappear, but that's where we're going to end.
Well, you go from real quick. You go from the fourth Doctor, which was obviously and arguably the most popular Doctor and Doctor Who at its peak. And then slowly you went through Peter Davison, which the show went down a little bit. Then you go to Colin Baker, who everybody hated. That dropped it down even more. And by the time Sylvester McCoy got in there, it was already so bad, nobody was hardly watching it. He was kind of doomed when he started the show.
Yeah, a lot of people would say John Nathan Turner, who was the producer, came in the last season of the fourth Doctor, ruined the show. He ran it all the way until the end. A lot of people would say he saved the show and kept it running as long as it did, since the BBC was no longer supporting it, with EastEnders coming out and trying to compete with Coronation Street. So I think the sad part is that it could have been a great era, but with shows coming out in the United States like Star Trek: The Next Generation, and we're finally starting to see. I mean, when you compare the late '80s Doctor Who to even the early seasons of Star Trek: The Next Generation, you can see that it was failing and it needed to go. So that's the end of the first Doctor Who era. We'll discuss the later eras.
We'll discuss the Doctor Who regeneration next week.
There you go. How he comes back. So there you go. And my movie of the week, as a final thought this week, is going to be Grabbers. It's Drunken Irish Tremors. Enjoy.
What are you doing in my swamp?
All right, and welcome to Schreck Swamp. Today we're going to be discussing reasons why Superman is better than Batman. Now, I know Batman is a more popular character. Everybody's going to sing the praises of Batman. They think he's better. I know personal people that are close to me who will argue all night about this subject, but in my estimation, Superman is better than Batman. What would you say, Mr. Joshua?
Well, while I agree with you, I do have some counterpoints and some things that I might not agree with you on, but I'm going to tread lightly. This is your swamp. I don't want to step on it too closely, but I think you're going to be a little harsher than you need to be, even if I do agree with you. And so I'll hopefully raise some points that hopefully you don't have responses for.
Alrighty, so the first 2 points I'm just going to kind of throw out there. These are simple points. The Phantom Zone is a much cooler place than the Arkham Asylum, and the whole idea of it is much cooler. Also, the two kind of similar graphic novels that you get, The Death of Superman and the Nightfall series, where Batman gets his back broken by Bane, Death of Superman's far superior in those stories. But let's move on to a little bit, kind of going to the Death of Superman and Nightfall series. My first kind of point is going to be replacements. When Superman died in the Death of Superman, he left a huge void. It was felt all across the DC universe, and Superman, they had the whole world without a Superman kind of storyline going on, and his life had to be fulfilled by 4 Supermen.
Whereas, I can't really argue against you on this one, because whereas Batman's death really didn't affect anything besides Batman as a comic.
Well, it wasn't his death. It was him.
His back. Excuse me, apologies. His back broken. His inability didn't affect the other DC comics. You saw the ramifications of Superman's death in Justice League and Supergirl. You saw it in other titles in their franchise, that because Superman was such an important character. He was so big. He touched all of the world. So I can't really disagree with you on that one.
Yeah, and his void had to be filled up by 4 Supermen who are all. I mean, that's what really got me into the Superman craze.
Let's talk about how 2 of them had their own spin-offs as well. I mean, Superboy,
Steel and Superboy ended up having their own comics. The other 2 kind of ended in the Superman story, but Batman had, when he got his back broken, his kind of mantle was taken up by Azrael, who was he was a relentless psychopath, and the story really wasn't that good as far as Azrael goes, but the 4 Supermen were really cool, and they got me into the whole Superman mythology, and they really started me out on Superman. Okay, so my next one is going to be reasons why Superman is better is originality. When Superman was originally created by Joe Shuster and Jerry Schlegel, Batman was basically kind of just an extension of the characters of the Lone Ranger and the Green Hornet, who had been out for a few years, and he was totally built up on the Superman was so popular they wanted another character, and Bob Kane created Batman based on those 2 characters.
Well, just because he's not a wholly original character, I mean, you can also say about how Superman was inspired by some writings about the Supermen and things like that. You can't really just dismiss his character completely because he was inspired by other things. Newton said, "I still only saw as far as I did because I stood on the back of giants." So you can't argue just because that's like saying that Pink Floyd isn't as good as the Beatles just because they came after the Beatles necessarily. Now, we're not going to get into that, but you can't argue that Batman's not as good as Superman just because he was inspired. His creation was inspired from other characters.
Okay, well, I can't argue this point. Superman was a better character because he's angstless. Superman, he behaves like a man, like a hero should be, whereas Batman sometimes comes off as a whiny little kid going around just bullying the other kids around Gotham.
Well, again, I'm going to have to say that I think that might be a problem, because what about Batman being more of a flawed character? Is Superman so perfect that he doesn't have these moral quandaries that he has to deal with?
Yeah, he does have moral quandaries. That's the thing. That's a little bit I'll get into a little bit later on one of my points, but that morality, his story is more interesting that way. But I'll go to my next one, which I believe is humility. Superman's a very, very humble guy. He could be the ruler of Earth, but he doesn't, and he spends most of his time as just a regular old Joe, a mild-mannered reporter, Clark Kent. Whereas you get Batman and Bruce Wayne, and he's kind of stuck up on himself a lot. That humility is a big part of the Superman character, and I think Batman misses out on that with his sometimes pompous rich guy attitude.
Well, I wouldn't say he has a pompous rich guy attitude. He's confident. That's the difference. He's sure of himself. Yes, they are 2 different things. You can say Bruce Wayne has an ego, but having an ego isn't always a bad thing. You do a lot of good things. It's the same reason that somebody in power, a president or somebody like that, they have to have a certain sense of suave, of swagger, of commanding presence that he does. And so, unlike Superman, who has the ability to have his presence in his powers, Batman has to use his attitude, his swagger, his mentality of how I'm gonna win you with my words.
Okay, so we kind of briefly mentioned my next point here: his uncompromising morality. Superman refuses to compromise his morality, and that's kind of sometimes he has a hard time dealing with that, and that's what makes his story so interesting. But Batman just kind of throws his morality away anytime it's convenient. Superman never does that.
Well, he doesn't necessarily always throw it away when it's convenient. He doesn't throw it away. He realizes that sometimes you have to make harsh decisions in life, and in life it's not always sunshine and rainbows, and you have to do bad things to get it done. Some people would argue that's an argument that could go a lot deeper, on how you treat prisoners, what you do to people, all things like that. That's a very complex issue, and I think that you can't just say he throws it out, because sometimes you have to make tough decisions.
So my next point is going to be superpowers. All right, so Batman's, don't get me wrong, I like Batman and everything like that. He's one of my favorite characters, but he just doesn't compare to Superman when he comes to this. He has a Batmobile and all kinds of gadgets and stuff like that, but none of those are nearly as cool as, flying or X-ray vision, any of that stuff, the heat vision, the strength, none of that stuff that Batman has even compares to those superpowers.
I can only argue a little with that, because I agree. When you're a little kid and you're pretending, you're a superhero, you don't really want to pretend. No one ever wants to pretend they're Batman. Like, oh, I'm going to throw my Batarang at you. I'm going to spray you with my bat shark repellent spray. Things like that. You don't pretend you're Batman. You want to be someone who has some power, who can do something. You want to teleport. You want to fly. You want to be able to do these things. So while I can't argue that, it is the idea of somebody whose power is their inventions and their toys and their gadgets is still something fun to play with. I agree it's not as cool as having all those powers, though.
And this is the one that I'm actually going to get the most arguments on, is I think that Superman has better villains. Now, the Joker is obviously the coolest villain of both superheroes. Nobody's going to argue that. Just read The Killing Joke and you'll know why.
Yeah, I can't argue that at all, because I think the Joker is one of the greatest villains of anything, any film, genre, comic book, everything. Anything of media I've ever gone into, he is one of the best overall, I would say.
And you've got very memorable performances from Jack Nicholson and Heath Ledger on that to kind of back that up. But when it comes down to the entirety of their villains, Superman, most of Batman's villains are just regular dudes who have some problems. Superman's villains include intergalactic bikers. Just look at Lobo. It includes a warlord of a planet whose only real competition in the universe is Superman. We're talking about Darkseid here, that was created by Jack Kirby, the great Jack Kirby. You also got the President of the United States. Lex Luthor becomes the president, and there's a whole big storyline with them two. Also, you get the unkillable monstrous beast, that wrecking ball beast that was Doomsday, who kind of got me into the whole Superman mythos. And I didn't have this one on my list, but I kind of want to bring it up, is Mr. Mxyzptlk, guy from the Dimension X. You don't get those kind of varied and cool characters with Batman. He does have the edge on the Joker, but not on the other characters. And
I can't agree with you on that. While I think that a lot of people underrate Superman's villains, and unfortunately in the movies, a lot of people, that's all they know, and they've really been underrepresented. I don't think I'm tired of Lex Luthor and Zod. We need to see the other ones. We need to see Brainiac. We need to see Darkseid. With these characters are good, but I think you're really missing how great some of these Batman's characters are. And a lot of them are misrepresented too. Mr. Freeze has never been positively represented in the franchise. The Penguin was, Burgess Meredith represented him best in the show. You can't really say there's a good way. Danny DeVito did okay, but these characters are fun. Catwoman has a lot of complex. She's kind of more of an anti-hero than a villain. There's so much you can say about his villains that people just ignore, and I think, while I wouldn't say Batman has the lead, they're probably about even. If I had to go into it, and I've never given that much credit to Superman's villain in our discussions in the past, but I'm going to go ahead and do it now, just because I was thinking about some of your arguments. But I don't think I can say they're far and away better than Batman's villains.
Well, and I'm going to come to my final reason now before we close it up. Superman is the first, the original, and the best. All other superheroes follow the archetype that Superman came up with, his code of conduct and everything like that. It was created by the Batman character, or the Superman character. Batman was created because of Superman's popularity, and the last time I checked, it was called Superhero, not Man-Hero.
While I can't agree with you that Superman is the best superhero in our argument, obviously I said it at the beginning, I agree with you, Superman is better than Batman. But just because it's called superhero and not man-hero doesn't mean you can't have a great. You can have great superheroes that don't have superpowers necessarily. That's a whole different argument. I can't agree that I can't agree wholly that just because he's the first, he's better. There's lots of things that come out first that lots of things improve on. So just because it was first doesn't mean it's the best. There's other superheroes that are better. It may not be Batman, but there are some.
And I disagree. Superman is by far my favorite superhero. If you don't like it, I know lots of people are going to have issues with me, ragging on Batman. I still love Batman, but I just think Superman is a far better character. So that's all I have to say about that. What's next?
It's the final countdown.
Welcome to our final countdown. Obviously, unless you've been living under a rock and don't care about entertainment news, you've probably heard that Robin Williams, the actor and comedian, has passed away. I know it's taken a while for us to get to this, but we're going to go over the top 5 Robin Williams movies. And I got to be honest with you, as I was going through trying to make this list, I didn't see a whole lot of movies that really grabbed me, that stood out. What are your thoughts on the Robin Williams movies?
Yeah, I have a lot that stand out, and I have a lot that some people I know like a lot, and I don't agree. And that would be like Good Morning Vietnam and the Dead Poets Society. A lot of people talk about these things like they're masterpieces or they're great films. I thought they were just okay. I can't really say they're that great, but there's a lot of films I do love. A lot of films I thought really stood out, especially a few from my childhood that really are marked in me, and I watch regularly.
Alrighty, so I'm going to go first here. I'm going to give an honorable mention to Aladdin. It's kind of one I've forgotten about. That's going to be my honorable mention for this one here.
I didn't. I'm going to go ahead and say I didn't put that in my list because I don't consider it. Because it's an animated film, I don't really count it as a really complete performance. So I thought about that film, and it is great, but I just couldn't, it's missing something else. It's more than just voice acting isn't the same as acting.
Yeah, and that's why it's an honorable mention. So my number 5 is going to be License to Wed, featuring that dude from The Office and
John Krasinski.
John Krasinski.
Something like that.
And Mandy Moore, and Robin Williams actually plays the pastor in that one. I thought, it's not, he steals the show in the movie, to be honest with you. Even though the story is about Mandy Moore and John, the Office dude, he really steals the show on that. What's your number 5?
My number 5 is Toys. I don't remember the exact years, from the early 90s, with Joan Cusack. I think Rip Torn has a part in it. LL Cool J. It's kind of kooky and off the wall. It's kind of a dramedy. It's pretty good. It's about people working in a toy factory. It's pretty entertaining. Definitely stands out as a little bit one of his more unusual performances.
All right, number 4 for me is going to be The Final Cut. The movie, honestly, really isn't that good. It's kind of a straightforward kind of role for Robin Williams, but I'm a sucker for interesting sci-fi concepts, even if the movie isn't that good. How about your number 4?
My number 4 is that you actually already mentioned, is License to Wed. I really love this movie. It stood out. I watched it in the theater. I remember I had a neighbor that had pirated it, and I was so mad that they didn't actually go to the theater and watch it because I wanted it to do good, and they kind of flopped. But it was a great film. You mentioned a lot of things about it that I don't need to repeat. I think it is a little better. I think their performance and their story is good, but we have slightly different tastes in films. So that's mine.
All right. So my number 3 is going to be Jumanji. This is kind of a childhood movie. I didn't think it was great. The story is really, really interesting, and it's just kind of a fun ride.
Yeah. My number 3 is going to be Hook, with Dustin Hoffman and Julia Roberts. There's a lot of great stars. It's definitely an ensemble kind of movie, even though it's his movie. Nice adaptation of the Peter Pan story that I thought kind of modernized it a little bit, brought a little. It didn't add something completely different to it, but it gave a fun new little twist to it. And there was a lot of fun. I remember being a kid and people yelling, was it Bangarang or something like that? I can't even remember it anymore. But I remember kids loving it when it came out. It was so colorful.
Alrighty, so my number 2 is actually going to be Mrs. Featherbottom. I mean, Mrs. Doubtfire. This is really the movie that you think of, for our generation anyway, when you think of Robin Williams. It's the most enjoyable and the most memorable role that he ever portrayed. So you can't really argue with Mrs. Doubtfire. It's a great flick, and it still holds up to this kind of day. I'm glad that they never kind of got around to making a sequel for it. It stands on its own.
My number 2 is going to be Jumanji. again, I saw this film when it came out. I watched it in the theater. David Allen Greer gives a great performance. It's just, I even like the kind of movie that's kind of a sequel, is a Thorough, that's not a direct sequel but written by the same guy. They're just fun kids movies, adventure. You kind of wish you could go on this adventure when you're a kid, and you kind of don't wish you could go on this adventure. And it was a great ride of excitement and adventure and mystery.
And so my number one is going to be 1 Hour Photo. It's another one of his most serious roles. I think it's the best acting he's ever done in his career, and you really get creeped out by the character that he plays. The movie isn't that great, to be honest with you, but his performance is what makes it stand out, and that's why it's my number one.
My number one, you already mentioned, as you kind of stole a lot of mine before I mentioned them, was Mrs. Doubtfire. I think you have to talk about how great this film is. There's a reason they wanted to do a sequel to it so many years later, and I thought it could have worked. I disagree with you. I thought it could have been pretty entertaining. It nailed his, you have the opening scene, which nails how great his voice acting work was while he's doing the little scene that gets him fired, where the bird and stuff like that. You watch the growth of his character, the development. I can't believe you didn't put it as your number one, to be quite honest, because it's amazing.
And the only reason I put 1 Hour Photo, I think Mrs. Doubtfire is a better movie, but 1 Hour Photo is the best acting of his career. And that brings an end to our second episode of Schreck Talk. I want to thank Sarah Plain-Tall and Johnny Rico for joining us on our Friends vs. Seinfeld discussion. Join us next week where we talk about my favorite movie franchise of all time, the Terminator series. We also finish up our 3-week-long Doctor Who segment, and we're going to rate our top 5 Weird Al parodies. See you then.
Go away or I shall taunt you a second time.